Okay, so for tides, I'm not going to talk tons and tons about tides, but just things to consider when we are getting on and off the water. And then again, picking our where we're going to be paddling. So tides are caused by gravitational pull of the moon and sun. It's affected more by the moon than the sun, but there is some effect by the sun. So um, tides move in conjunction with the phases of the moon. And we're going to see peaks at full moons and new moons, and then lows or lower tides at those halfway points between them. Tides are very long period waves that move through the ocean in response to the forces exerted by the moon and sun. So they're basically big waves that are moving, or the whole ocean, or these waves are shifting back and forth through the entire ocean, which creates tides. Tides originate in the oceans and progress towards coastlines where they appear as the regular rise and fall of the sea surface. When the highest part or crest of the wave that is the tide, reaches a particular location, that's a high tide. When we have when we see the trough of that wave at shore, it's a low tide. So high tides and low tides are really that big wave that's moving, or the wave that's moving back and forth in the ocean is the corresponding crest and trough of that tide, or sorry, of that wave. Differences in height between the tides, high tide and low tide, is called the tidal range. So very similar to when we were labeling waves, we have a crest, we have a trough, and then we have the tidal range in between. So if we look at tides, so this is a tide period. You can see here we have a high down to the low, and it's always just this kind of flow here. So if this was one day, what we'll usually see in a day, most often, is two highs and two lows in a day. Sometimes the tides flatten out so much that there's not enough difference between them, and it looks like maybe we just have two tides, but there's always four, but if they're so close together, sometimes they just kind of line up. So again, we have a tidal period is going to be the distance between the entire tidal shift. So that's going to be essentially our day here. And then we have the high tide, and then we have a lower high water, and then we have a low water, and then the lower high water. So there's always a high, and then a high that's not as high, and then a low that's very low, and then one that's not as low. I'm kind of slaughtering the way I'm saying that. And then this picture here is just to show you the difference between the high and the low. So this is our tidal range. Tidal range here, because it's steep, is fairly small. If that was a very gradual entry, our tidal range could be small, but could be over a longer period of land as well. So we'll see that here in a second. So with tides, if we look here, we have the sun, and on a new moon, where we can't see the moon, we have the sun here, we have the new moon here, and that's creating a bulge here in the oceans that creates our high tide. So it's hard to see on the image here, but there is a darker shade of blue and then a lighter shade of blue. The darker shade of blue is the amount that's affected by the sun. The larger shade is the amount that's affected by the moon. So just, again, to reiterate, moon affects it more. And here we have the combined gravitational pull of the two together, and that's why we see a bigger tide, a high tide. The full moon is when the moon is, so we would have the sun, the earth, and the full moon is also going to create a greater tidal range. So we're going to see higher highs, lower lows, and greater tidal ranges on high or new moons and full moons. The halfway between points, we call these neap tides. So a neap tide, they're always going to be smaller. And with the moon here at the top and bottom of the earth in this graphic, we get a smaller bulge creating the tide here. So if we look at the graph to the right, so spring tides are the new moon and full moon. Neap tides are third and first quarter. So for our spring tides, they're larger. And on the new moon, we're going to tend to see larger tides again. Neap tides, the tidal range is lower. So when we look at some of the tide charts that we have, some of the graphics that we can pull up online, websites, they often show you the phases of the moon because that gives you an indication of where you are and where the trend is going for the tides growing or the tides dropping from day to day. So that's what's affecting it. And yeah, at a high level. So why do we care about tides? Main one is getting in and out of the water. This is low tide at Boundary Bay in Delta. You can be more than a kilometer out. So that has a couple of effects on us. If we're paddling in it when that water's going out, because it's fairly shallow, we're getting that water moving fairly fast back out to sea. So it's really easy for us to kind of get caught with it. Or if we're paddling way out and we don't watch the tides, we have a really, really long way to walk back. You definitely don't want to time your paddle with when that tide is low, show up at the beach and have to wait for the high. So we need to pick and choose our launching and landing in areas that we know we have this super shallow gradient going into the water, because we're going to have to walk a lot. And we're going to see the same thing at Spanish Banks. Spanish Banks is notorious for, the beach triples in sizes on the really low tides. So it affects our launching and landing on the beach. So that's a big one. So we need to understand where the tides are and make sure that we're not carrying those boards a really long way. So this is a picture of Spanish Banks here when the tide's out. This is Jericho Sailing Center. So because Spanish Banks is so gradual, the way Jericho Sailing Center has been engineered with the pier and the break walls, it's a much steeper entry into the ocean. So even at the low tide, we always have good water to launch in. So this is an example of, it doesn't really matter what the tide, we have to walk a little bit further, but we still have lots of water there for coming and going, and we don't have to watch it as much, or we don't have to be as mindful of it when we are picking launching and landing. So when we're looking at tides, so this is the tide forecast website. We can have a peek at later. You can see here where we get our highs, we get our lows. I like this one because I like visuals. It shows you where you are right now. If you're and it's done by day. So this is a couple years old, this one. If you click on Friday here, it expands Friday. If you click on the next day, it expands it out. So it's really easy to see. And then it tells you your highs and lows in meters. So when we're looking at meters, we're looking for it's meters above chart datum. So we'd have to look at a marine chart to see what that applies to, but it's not the lowest, it's the lowest average tide that's ever been seen. It doesn't mean that the tide can't go below that. You can have a negative tide, but it's the lowest average tide you've ever seen. So when we say 4 meters, it's the lowest average is 4 meters on top of that. So 4.8 meters is pretty high. Down here in the trough, 0.5 meters is really low. So the tidal change here from high to low is quite steep. So we're going to see a significant difference in the water. That's going to affect us launching and landing at Spanish Banks. But what we'll get into next is this is also going to create greater currents. So an area that tends to have currents created by tides, the bigger the water exchange, the higher the currents. Currents can either work with us by carrying us in the direction that we want, or they can work against us by carrying us in the direction we don't want to go, and we have to fight against them. So we want to start being aware of tide changes because they can create more currents, which can make our paddling more challenging. And down here you can see we have wind, which is built in. We have cloud cover, which tells us a bit about the day. But then we also have the phases of the moon. So we can see phases of the moon in conjunction with the tide. So a lot of neat information right in one spot. And I think it goes at least 1 week out. It might be 2 weeks out. So you can get an idea of where things are going. Tides are predictable. They're not forecast. So you can go to Environment Canada and download tide tables, and that'll show you those tides for um, all the tide stations, a year in advance, because they're calculated, and the tides don't change because the moon doesn't change, and all of these things that create tides are consistent. So we can easily look in advance to see what the tides are going to be. It's not like the weather where we have to wait and see truly what's going to happen, as it's happening. So currents created by tides, I mentioned before. So I started getting to a little bit. Our tidal range, the greater the tidal range, we're going to see more current. When we're talking about tides, you'll hear the words flood and ebb. So when the tide is coming in, it's called a flood. When the tide is going out, it's called an ebb. And we'll get this, we call currents the same. So those words are going to be consistent for telling us is the water coming in or out. And Venturi effect is the same thing here. So this is where we have to really start looking at, where we're going to be paddling when it comes to tides, because we need to be as aware of currents in some places as much as we need to be aware of wind. So the same Venturi effect in this diagram here, that we know that when the wind comes in here and goes through this narrowing, it's going to speed up, and then as we get through, it's going to slow down because it opens wider again. Venturi effect applies to fluids, so the exact same thing's happening with water. When the water is coming through this narrowing, it speeds up substantially. And why does that matter to us? If we're trying to paddle out to the ocean and the tide's coming in, we're fighting a current, and we might not be able to pass it depending on how narrow it is. The other areas are, so this bottom right-hand corner picture here is Schwartz Bay. So this is where, the ferry comes into from Swassen if you're going to Victoria. So there's a bunch of islands down here. These islands, as we start going through them, these are all tidal areas, and we can get a pretty good tidal exchange through here. If there's a high tidal or high difference, a big difference between the high and the low, we're going to see big currents between these islands because that water is being pushed through a narrower place. So we have to take that into consideration on our timing when we make those passages. So anytime we're going through islands, the narrower the effect, the greater the effect. The narrower the passage, the greater effect we're going to see. We could easily come into currents in a narrower passage that are just beyond our ability to paddle against. Flip side with that is if we are running with currents that are, say, 5 knots, if the current's moving us at 5 knots, suddenly we could be having a lot of problems just steering our boards because we're on moving water. We're in river conditions. We have to know how to eddy in, eddy out, how to ferry across. We need a whole other set of techniques to be able to manage that water when we're moving with it, so we don't end up going too fast and being out of control. So definitely things to consider when we are working with currents in tidal waters. So the amount of water exchange is going to speed them up. If it's a smaller exchange, then it's not going to be as drastic. But we have to be aware of what to expect. Another thing I'm going to mention, I'm not going to talk about the full theory behind it or the full analysis behind it, but you've probably all heard of slack water. Slack water is often thought of being somewhere towards the top of the tide. The water never really stops. It's kind of an anomaly. It's not a truth. It's just a word that we use. What you will find is tidal changes slow on the troughs, and they slow on the crest. So if you are making these passages through these tight areas, you want to do it close to the high and close to the low to have as still a water as possible. As you hit the halfway point, it's about the middle third or so of the graph here, or the line here, that is where you are going to see your fastest currents. So if you mistime this and you land at this little spot right here, going through these little islands right here, you're in a lot of current. But if you time it here, you've got an easy passage. So we need to be aware of the same conditions that squeeze wind and make it go faster. We'll do the same with the water, and tidal changes is going to be constant on the ocean, and it's going to be constantly creating the potential for current. So that's why I wanted to leave that in this case, but just something we can do calculations that tell us, when's the best place, what speeds it's going to be at about, we divide this whole line here into 12, and then we divide the difference between 12, and we can get speeds, and we can get rates of when we can calculate when it's going to be the highest and when it's going to be the lowest as well. But that's beyond what I wanted to hit today. Just be aware of it. All right, in summary. So before you go, wind, direction and speed, offshore, onshore, will it change? How will it change? Is this within my abilities? So we want to be aware of all of these things when we're going out, and we're only going to know that by looking at forecasts 2 days out, a day out, the morning of, to give us an idea of what are the trends and what's expected. This last one is huge. And I should have also put in, is it within the group's ability? Because when we're traveling in groups, we have to move at the rate the group can move. So we have to take group dynamics into account when we are working in groups, because the slowest person is going to be the one that dictates the path and the rate of travel in the group. With tides, can I expect wind waves? How long is the wind going to be blowing? How strong? How long has it been blowing? Are there going to be waves? Are the waves going to be there when I still get there? Are they going to drop by the time I go? So these are things that we want to start being able to guess in our head before we go. So once you've done it a number of times, I know I'm talking about it a lot, but it just starts happening. And you'll be building this experience in your head and looking at it quickly. For tides, high, low tides, what are the highs and the lows? How do the tides affect me, considering speeds and currents when we're planning our routes in advance? Much more important when we're looking at, multi-day trips, hugely important for multi-day trips. Safety, proper training and skills. Have the training and the skills to tackle the water that you are going to tackle. Lived experience is the best way to learn, but we have to have a core foundation to build those lived experiences on. Proper safety equipment, always. Big one in a lot of places that we can paddle, there's no cell communication. So how are you going to signal for help if you need it? You have to have a plan for that. Easiest way to manage that is satellite device, or somebody knows when you're coming home, and if you don't come home, they know to go looking for you. That is the most cost-effective one. Have a paddle plan you leave on shore with somebody who is responsible enough to go looking for you if you need to be looked for. And paddle with a buddy, paddle with friends. Before I flip over to the other things that I wanted to talk about, we'll open it up to questions. This is me. This will be on the slides. These are other things that I do, so a bit of a plug here. I'm running a touring course, so it's not a full multi-day, but we are going to turn this one into an overnighter in September to really start working on these skills: communication, reading tides, reading currents, and taking our abilities to work with that, pack, and be prepared in advance. Working with Dennis on crabbing, and then standard courses that I'm offering again and again to get everyone those core function or foundations. Our basic sub skills, your starting point, advanced, and then I also run instructor courses. So easiest way to find me is website, Facebook, groups. You all know, you all found me. You all found this thing, or this workshop. So you all know where to find me.